Hello friends and fellow seekers of the good, true, beautiful. It's Mike here and welcome to Identity Matters. G.K. Chesterton one time wrote these words: "With every step of our lives, we enter into the middle of some story which we are certain to misunderstand." I think one of the most transformative things that my clients realize through the coaching process, and it's also one of the most disruptive things, is that you are not who you think you are. This is an earth-shattering revelation for any of us as we go through the coaching process, but it's also one of the most freeing. And it really comes from the fact that we are narrative creatures, that we survive the world by creating a story to explain it to ourselves. And this includes the story that we craft about us. This happens right off the bat as we come into the world and start growing up as young kids. We begin to look to the environment to tell us who we are. And we like to think, as we come into adulthood, we tend to think that this is just our personal history, that we're just looking back over the history of our lives and saying, oh yes, well, this, and this all informed me that this is who I am, and so the world was a perfect mirror, and it just reflected back to me the truth of who I am, and so this is who I am. But that's not actually what happened. Now, if the world, and if your family, and if all your friends, and if society was a perfect and healthy and pure mirror, then perhaps that is how it would turn out, that you would get this pristine reflection back upon yourself that would tell you who you are, and you would be able to accurately create a story or a narrative of yourself that was true. But as you well know, your family is not perfect, and your friends are not perfect, and society is not perfect, and the environment is not perfect. And so what ends up happening is that as we grow up in the world, we look out into the environment, to our families, to our friends, to society, and we start picking up data points and crafting from them, almost like they are events in a narrative. We start crafting from them a story. And the story is our story. It's the story that we're crafting about who we are and our place in the world and the way that we're to function in it. The problem with that, there's a couple of problems with that. One of the problems with that is that we're doing that when we're very young and we don't have the wherewithal to genuinely craft an accurate tale. Now again, if we had perfect voices in our environment, if our parents saw us perfectly clearly, if our friends always reflected back the truth, if our teachers or society at large always told us the truth of who we were, it would be easier. But that doesn't happen. So we're left to interpret it ourselves, and that is always flawed. So on the one hand, we're not a trustworthy narrator of our own identity when we're young. The second thing is that the mirror, the actual events out in the world that are giving us data points, are also flawed. So the things that are happening are not always trustworthy bits of information. An example might be, let's say that there's a young girl who, in truth, is incredibly graceful. And if she was given her full wings spread, like if she was given freedom to spread her wings and to develop herself, she could become an amazing ballerina. She could become an incredible dancer. She could be an amazing athlete. Like there's all kinds, she has all this physical ability, right? But one day, she's out with a bunch of her friends and some classmates, and perhaps she's in the cafeteria lunchroom at school, and she happens to trip over something, and her food goes flying, and she spills out on the floor, and everyone, hundreds of kids, see it. And that becomes a seminal moment for her when she becomes the focus of ridicule and laughter, and it goes deep. And she makes a mental note in her head that a part of her defining narrative is that she's a klutz. And if she wants to survive in the world, if she wants to be accepted and not kicked out of society, if she wants to not be rejected, she's going to have to hide the fact that she's a klutz, right? So that becomes for her a defining piece of her narrative. So I just give that as an example. Could also be the young man who doesn't get picked for the sports team, who doesn't make it in his first few years trying out for things. And maybe it's simply that he's a bit of a late bloomer, but in fact, he's got great athletic ability. But because he doesn't get picked, he decides he doesn't have what it takes. And he spends the rest of his life believing that he has to just try extra hard. And so he makes all the money, he wins all these awards, he pushes himself athletically. He does start succeeding, but because he has this internal narrative that tells him that he doesn't have what it takes and he's actually a loser inside, none of those successes actually hit home. They actually scratch the itch because he has a narrative that overrides his ability to believe the data. Right, so 2 examples for you. But all of that adds up to, we have a narrative, what psychologists and coaches call a defining narrative of who we are, that ends up being inaccurate. We're taking data points from our environment as we grow up that are not exhaustive. They're key data points at seminal moments, and we craft from that a narrative. That narrative is taken from an inaccurate mirror, and we are not trustworthy narrators. We're not trustworthy interpreters of that data. So as we come into adulthood, we're operating out of a script that is flawed and warped, like a funhouse mirror. And we're trying to operate as if that is who we are. And many times when clients come into the work of coaching, they find that they have this long-standing frustration with life because they feel like they're in a straitjacket in one way or another. They feel as if they're, if you know biblical references, they're like David in Saul's armor trying to fight Goliath, and they're not made for that. Their life is ill-fitting for them, right? And so they are, what's actually happening is the story that they've told themselves about who they are is not true, and so their life doesn't fit. They are a graceful gazelle who believes it's an awkward buffalo, right? And so they're trying to live out this awkward buffalo role when they're a graceful gazelle, or it could be something completely different. But the point is, they're not in the truth of who they are. So part of the work of coaching in this way, it's called story work or called narrative coaching, is to really begin to unpack the story you tell yourself about who you are, and to look at it from one step away, as if you were reading a story in a book, and to begin to put a critical eye to, is this actually true? Because now you see you're not a child anymore. Now you have adult faculties. Now you can look back at the data points in the history that created the story, created the narrative, and begin to reinterpret those things more accurately to craft a deeper truth of who you are. This is very deep work, and it is very difficult work. And the reason it's difficult is because these narratives, these defining narratives that we carry around, are deeply seated within our unconscious. And to uproot them is no simple matter of changing your mind. They feel to our subconscious like a life preserver. Literally, they are the thing that has kept us afloat as we've moved through the world. And when you begin to try to shift it, it feels like dying. It does. It feels like if I let go of this identity, then who am I? I won't know who I am. I will cease to exist. So there is a very real kind of death and resurrection process that is involved in this kind of narrative work. So it isn't easy work, but it is really gratifying work when you can begin to peel off the layers that have been the constricting layers that have been holding you in a narrative that is too small for you or is ill-fitting for you, and begin to actually kind of stretch out and fill out the space of who you actually are, and begin to make choices in life that are genuinely reflective of the truth of yourself rather than the narrative that was constructed in an imperfect environment with an imperfect young mind. That becomes so redemptive and so freeing for anyone, any client. So that work takes a lot of different steps. I just want to give you one step today, the place to begin, and it's called the LifeMap. Now, you may have heard of a LifeMap before, but what it basically is simply a way to chart the events of your life from an adult perspective, rather than to kind of like to write out a personal history or to write out the story of your life from the child's point of view, but more or less to kind of take a step back and using a bit of your analytical mind combined with a bit of your heart intelligence to map out the defining moments, the turning points, the high points, the low points, the chapters and seasons of your life in a way that begins to help you notice what were the data points that I pulled as a child, as a young person, to define the story of my life, to create my defining narrative, and how did I sort of weave this tale together? Because you'll begin to see immediately that you didn't take all the data. You just took key data points that you decided were important, and you wove a tale out of those. So somebody else could have come along and looked at the history of your life, taken completely different data points and woven from them a completely different narrative. But you chose this narrative, right? So you just begin to see through the life map what those data points are, what that narrative is. And then once you do that, you begin to, the next step is simply to have a bit of an analytical or curious stance of what do you notice as you look at this map, what stands out to you, what seems suspect to you, what do you wish that you had known then that you know now, as you look at the story that you've crafted about yourself, and where does the story feel ill-fitting to you? So two things I'll offer you as we close out today. One is I want to send you the life map with instructions of how to do it. All you need to do is down below there's a link to sign up for the Identity Matters newsletter. If you sign up for that using that link, I will send you the life map and the instructions. And then the second is, if you want to have a free session with me to talk about your life map or to talk about what's next, I'd be happy to do that. All you have to do is go to my website at michaelwarden.com, go to the connect page, and just send me a note and say, hey, I'd like to do a free session to talk about the results of this, and I will set one up with you. So just to see what the next step might be. Narrative work is so fulfilling, but it is definitely deep work. So be prepared to be intrigued by the story that you crafted about yourself. It's very interesting stuff. So yeah, do those two things, and that's what I want to share with you today. I'll also include links to a couple of blog posts that I wrote some time ago about this down in the description below, so you can read about this more if you'd like to. Again, thank you so much. Please like this video and subscribe if you haven't. Share it with a friend who might need to see it. And I look forward to seeing you in the next Identity Matters.